Okay, I think we're ready. I'll start off my introductory spiel here, Dr. Ewing.
All right.
My name is Jerry Gill. Today is December 18th, 2008. I'm visiting with Dr. Sidney Ewing in the library in the Oklahoma State University campus in Stillwater, Oklahoma. This interview is for the O State Storage Program, which is a part of the Oklahoma Oral History Research Program. Dr. Ewing, I appreciate you taking time to be with us today.
I'm glad to do it.
And I know you've had a long and illustrious career at Oklahoma State University. But could we back up maybe just a little bit and find out a little more about you? Could you share a little bit about your early life, where you grew up, a little bit about your family?
Sure, I'd be glad to do that. I'm originally from Georgia. I was born, I should have been born on a farm like all my siblings were, but I always said I created problems even before I got here. So my older siblings and younger brother were all born at home, but I was born in a hospital, Emory University Hospital near Atlanta, Georgia. I grew up on a farm that became a dairy farm. Was a cotton farm at the time I was born, but we later went into the dairy business. And I went to school as grade school at Mansfield, Georgia, small community in Newton County, Georgia, a county that was formed in 1821 from pre-existing counties. And my family has been in that county since it was formed, and they're still there, except for me. And after grade school, I went to high school in Covington, Georgia, the county seat. About the time I was in the 9th grade, they combined all the high schools in the county, and so I was in the first class of 1952 to graduate from Newton County High School. I then went to Emory University, not the main campus in Atlanta, but to the original campus, which was built in 1836. It's in Oxford, Georgia. Today it's called Oxford College of Emory University. So I went there for 1 year, and in the process finally decided for sure that I was going to become a veterinarian, and so I had to transfer to the University of Georgia to finish my pre-professional work, and did that, and then graduated from the veterinary school at the University of Georgia in 1958.
Dr. Ewing, let me ask you, what was there an influence or something that caused you to decide you want to be a veterinarian?
Yes, I think it's fair to say that I had a lot of interests, and I thought about journalism, I thought about horticulture, I thought about botany. Had an older brother who studied animal science and was coming back to the farm with my dad. And I knew I didn't really want to do that, but I was interested in animals and and also in medicine, and I thought a lot about dentistry. And then an old dentist said to me one day, he happened to be the family dentist, and he said to me, I hear you thinking about going into dentistry. And I said, well, it's one of the things I'm considering. And he said, you see this little circle? I've been walking in this same circle for 40 years. He said, you don't want to do that. And I decided that he was probably right. And it also happened that my father had been a hunting buddy of his own local veterinarian in the late 30s. And that local veterinarian had later decided to go to graduate school and got his PhD, and had come back to the University of Georgia from the University of Illinois. And he was actually the founding dean of the veterinary school. And this man, whose name was Thomas J. Jones, he was actually a Welshman transplanted into Georgia. He had an impact on my decision ultimately to try to go to veterinary school. And so I did that. And of course, I always said my father thought I would come home and be the veterinarians for the dairy farm, which was attractive in a way, but I decided instead to go to graduate school. I'd become very interested in parasitology as a veterinary student. And with my background in dairy, I decided to go to the University of Wisconsin, study dairy cattle parasites, and
So you did your master's work.
did a master's degree at the University of Wisconsin.
And
But the day I got there to start this, I'd been up to interview, and they'd accepted me, and they'd agreed that with my background in dairy cattle, it'd be good if I studied dairy cattle parasites. And I was very pleased with that. Well, I arrived a few months later to actually start. And they said, oh, by the way, we just got a big grant from the National Institutes of Health to study swine influenza. And we need you to work on swine lungworms. At that time, they thought there was a tie-in between swine influenza and the lungworm. And so I found myself working on an entirely different host animal. But I learned in a hurry to enjoy working with swine and did that.
what can you tell us about your there at Georgia?
Mm-hmm.
You were in I said one of the was that one of the earlier classes from how long?
I think we were the eighth class.
Eighth class.
Now, the University of Georgia had a veterinary school before the Great Depression. In fact, the University of Georgia got started with a veterinary school at the same time that Oklahoma A&M attempted to start a school right around the time of the First World War, 1917, 1918, in that era. Georgia got off the ground. Oklahoma State University, or Oklahoma A&M, then did not. And I've written a book about that, by the way. But I think it was 1933 that the veterinary school closed at the University of Georgia. And Dean Jones, who I referred to a bit ago, was fond of saying that he closed the old school and then he reopened the new one because he was a member of the last class that graduated. And then, of course, he was in private practice, and then he went and got a PhD at Illinois and came back. And he really was the founding dean of the new school, which started about the same time Oklahoma A&M did, right after the Second World War. So they graduated their first class in 1950. I was a member of the class in 1958. Oklahoma A&M graduated its first class in 1951.
Dr. So you did your master's work there at Wisconsin.
Correct.
Right after you finished your
Right after I finished
at Georgia, and that was in the college there of veterinary medicine. Did your master's there? Is that correct?
Well, Wisconsin did not have a College of Veterinary Medicine at that time. They had a Department of Veterinary Science, which was almost exclusively research. They taught a few graduate courses and maybe one or two undergraduate courses, but it was just a Department of Veterinary Science. But it was one of the most active graduate programs in veterinary science in the U.S. Interestingly, though, I told many students over the years that I grew up enough at the University of Wisconsin to realize that the major professor was more important than the university. And I got my master's and then transferred to Oklahoma State University because, in my opinion, the best veterinary parasitologist in the country was Wendell H. Krull, who was teaching at Oklahoma State. It was Oklahoma State by that time.
And you sort of answered where I was going to go with the next question. But how did you find out about Oklahoma State University at the time? A&M, but
yeah. Well, actually, it was Oklahoma State by the time I knew it because I finished my master's in 1960.
Oh, that's right.
And Oklahoma State had, I believe, shifted its name in 1957.
Correct.
Well, the veterinary community is really a fairly small community. And in the process of being at Wisconsin for 2 years, I learned a lot about who was doing important work in the field of veterinary parasitology. I had learned while I was a veterinary student at the University of Georgia about a piece of work that Dr. Krull had done. He was already on the faculty here, but he went out to Cornell University in Ithaca, New York in the summer to work on a specific problem that folks at Cornell couldn't solve. And he solved it. And so that was one of the reasons. And so I wrote to Dr. Kroll, and he said, well, I have a position for a teacher, and since you've got a DVM and you've got a master's, or you're about to finish a master's, you would qualify. And you could also at the same time work on your PhD. And so that I came down over the 4th of July holiday and interviewed with Dr. Kroll. In those days, you could fly clear to Stillwater on a commercial plane. But anyway, I came here and interviewed, and then in September of 1960, I came to OSU, which turned out to be the first of 3 times. I've been here, went away to teach at Kansas State after I finished my PhD, then went to Mississippi State. It did not have a veterinary school at that time. It does today. But I went there in my first administrative role as a department head of veterinary science, very much like the department that had been at Wisconsin, although not nearly as big as Wisconsin's, nor as nearly as well known.
Doctor, you mentioned some of the conversations I've had. Dr. Kroll was a legend, should I say? I'm trying to think of Robert. Can you tell me a little bit about Dr. Kroll and your relationship? He was pretty tough, I understand, pretty tough taskmaster.
That is his reputation, and it is true. He was tough, but he was fair. And I got along with him very well. I think maybe he had mellowed some by the time I was his last student, actually. But there are many, many stories from his veterinary students who said he was really tough. But I came here, specifically to study with him and to teach here, and I can remember one of the stories I've enjoyed telling over the years. I met a faculty wife. Her husband was in pathology, and the first time I met her, she said, "Are you that new guy in parasitology?" And I said, "Yes, I am." And she said, "And you expect to get a degree from Kroll?" And I said, "Well, I'm intending to." And she said, now mind you, I was 25, 26 years old. She said, "You'll have a gray beard down to," and she signaled her waist, "You'll have a gray beard down to here before you ever get a degree out of that band."
That caused you to have second thoughts?
I have to say, it did make me think, have I done the right thing? But it turned out it was really quite the best move I could have made.
What did you learn more than anything else under Dr. Kroll?
Well, I learned the necessity for very meticulous work. I learned that you have to do the laboratory work yourself. You can't turn it over to a technician. Now, to be sure, there are things, and especially in the modern day, that you absolutely do depend on technicians. But if you do, you must be certain that you have trained them to do the work at the level of competence that you would do it yourself. But in those days, of course, we didn't have many technicians around Oklahoma State University. And I was just thinking earlier today, as we approach the holidays, of course, I'm retired and have been for some years, but if I'm in town, I'm at the vet school almost every day because I still have things I'm working on, I'm interested in parasitology and in other things too. But I was just thinking today that this is the time of year that I would always find myself under pressure because the veterinary students that I had hired to help me with my animals, my research, would be going home for the holiday. And that meant 7 days a week. Over the holidays, I'd be the one who would be taking care of the animals as well as any sampling and everything. And so, I learned that you have to be on top of things. And it served me well because even while I was working on my PhD with Dr. Kroll, I discovered a parasite that had been known in the old world for a long time, but we were the first to find it in North America, and in fact, only the second to find it in the New World. And if I had not been working and having the sort of work habits that I had of being with my animals every day, 7 days a week, having my hands on them every day, I might have missed that. And so that was a very important thing that I learned.
Well, I want to pursue your research a little more, but let me back up. I'm going to ask you first of all, you seem early on that parasitology is what you want to do. Well, what influenced you to go to parasitology?
Well, when I was a veterinary student at the University of Georgia, I took my first parasitology course, and I was just fascinated by the phenomenon of parasitism. And I had, when I was a pre-vet student, I had taken, as I had to, of course, botany courses. And I was always interested in botany, and as I said earlier, I even considered majoring in it. But one of the things that happened when I took botany was that I was hired to be a teaching assistant in the botany department. And I did that till I got in veterinary school. And then once I was in veterinary school, there was no time. I had to be in class all day. But the botany department liked me, I guess, and they let me stay on, and my job was to grade papers. And I would grade papers at odd hours. When I get tired of studying, I'd stop and grade papers. Well, what this led to was the head of the botany department recommended me, and I've always been sort of astonished by this, recommended me to a U.S. Department of Agriculture plant pathologist as a summer worker, rather than one of his botany students. Anyway, it was a piece of good luck. I really enjoyed coming to know this plant pathologist, and I worked 2 summers doing that. And one of the things that I did in the process was to examine the soils where pine tree nurseries operate. And I had a piece of good luck there that I discovered a new nematode. So that fit right in with what I was learning in veterinary school, is that there are nematodes that parasitize plants as well as parasitize animals. So, that probably underscored my interest and sort of pointed me toward veterinary parasitology.
We talked about Dr. Crow. Maybe back up. Who are some other professors you remember now? Two comments. If I recall right, the graduate program just started in 53, I think, didn't it? And you started in 58, so actually you were one of the earlier graduate students in the program.
Yes. Dr. Kroll and Dr. Stan Newcomer are 2 people who I remember who were on the committee. Mm-hmm. Kroll was the chair of the committee that actually got the graduate program off the ground for the veterinary. Of course, it was in the graduate college, but it was tied to the veterinary college. And so Dr. Everett Besh, who left OSU in 1968 to become the founding dean of veterinary medicine at Louisiana State University, was Kroll's next to last student, and I was Kroll's last student. And on my PhD committee, Kroll was the chair, but I also had Dr. Andy Monlocks, who was the head of pathology department. I had Dr. D.E. Howell, who was known as Mike Howell, I'm not sure why. He was the head of the entomology department. And then Dr. Bill Brock, who was later a dean of veterinary medicine, was also on my PhD committee. And then the final member of the committee was a young man, a Dr. Dwyer, who was in agronomy, and he later left OSU. But as to professors that I really remember, of course, the very first course I took when I came here was Dr. D.E. Howell's medical entomology. I sat in on Dr. Kroll's veterinary parasitology courses, but he wouldn't give me any credit for that because I'd already had veterinary parasitology at the University of Georgia, but I had to be there every day. And of course it was good that I was, because I learned so much, and I also was a better teacher in the laboratory, teaching the laboratory part of his course or helping him teach it. But probably one of the greatest scholars, in my opinion, that I ever ran into at this university or any other was in the agronomy department here at OSU. And his name, I'll lead up to this with what a great guy he was, and I'm having trouble remembering his name, but it'll come to me. He later left and went to the University of Illinois, but he was a great wheat geneticist. He was interested in grasses of all kinds, and he traveled all over the world and collected germplasm from all over the world. And he taught a course in classical evolution, and he taught another course in sort of mechanics of evolution. His name was Harlan, Dr. Harlan, Harlan. I believe that's the way you spell it. But he was terrific. And so all of the members of my committee were good folks. But I would say of the great teachers that I actually took courses from, and I took a graduate course from Krull. Krull was a great teacher. And Dr. Harlan was wonderful. And D.E. Howell was also very good.
Dr. Ewing, what do you remember about the facilities? You were laughing earlier a little bit about they were quite what they are today, in terms of technicians and technology. But could you kind of discuss a little about maybe the facilities, equipment we had, the clinics and the labs?
Yes. When I came here in 1960, the veterinary school, as you may know, was really built in phases. There was a wing built in the 40s, and then there was a wing built in the 50s, and that's the one I moved into. It was the new facility. And then very early, I think around 1962, 63, while I was still still a PhD student and a veterinary teacher, they built a third wing. We call it the South Wing today. And this was well before the teaching hospital. The teaching hospital was in that middle wing that I was in. That is, the small animal part was. Large animal was over in the old wing, and the faculty offices for the large animal clinic was an old temporary building.
I heard some of the offices were even stalls.
Mm-hmm.
Is that right?
Yes, I believe that's right. They had stalls. But even though I was in a new wing, we didn't have a lot, but I didn't really need a lot. I needed a microscope, and I needed a place for experimental animals. And one of the shortcomings was that we did not have good isolation facilities the way we have today. And so that was a problem for me. But we managed, and sometimes when we got handed a lemon, we made lemonade out of it. It's kind of too technical to go into probably, but this disease that I referred to earlier is called ehrlichiosis. Maybe I'll spell it for the transcriber. It's EHRLICHIOSIS. We had a naturally occurring case in the clinic, and we don't like to admit it, but we had a tick problem in our own teaching hospital. And I believe what happened was that a tick.
Tick-borne disease.
It's a tick-borne disease. And a tick probably bit that naturally occurring case in our hospital, and then later transferred it to an animal that shouldn't have had any disease. And so it turned out that that was one of those cases where we made lemonade.
Now, you went on and did some pretty significant research. You and I think some of the other professors, is that right? Could you discuss that a little bit?
Well, we were fortunate finding that organism problem in dogs. I did work on that for some time. And then soon after I came here the second time, which was in 1968, one of the 1965 graduates of our college was in practice over in Arkansas. And he remembered learning about ehrlichiosis. And so he called me one day and he said, I think I've got a case, but he said, I'm not sure, can I send you some blood? And I said, of course. So he sent me some blood, and he remembered that some of my dogs, experimental dogs, really became very, very ill. And this dog that he was working with was sick, but not seriously ill. Well, it turned out that the blood he sent me, I then put into an experimental animal and produced a disease that was similar but milder. Mm-hmm. And eventually we discovered that was another new in quotes, but another new organism. And 20 years later, we found that in 1972. 20 years later, that organism was named for me, Ehrlichia ewingii.
Would you say that again?
It's called Ehrlichia ewingii. You just put two eyes on the end of Ewing. People at the Centers for Disease Control did that. And the reason they did that was in 1987, there appeared in the New England Journal of Medicine a case report, really, of a man who was from Detroit, Michigan, but he'd been visiting in Arkansas, and he was bitten by ticks while he was in Arkansas. And so this was published in the most prestigious medical journal in the country. And they reported it as Ehrlichia canis, which was the organism I had found here in 1962 as the first case in human beings. Well, this didn't really make very good sense to us. And so a couple of my graduate students and I wrote a letter to the New England Journal of Medicine contesting this identification. And the upshot of it for me personally was that I got invited down to the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta and helped to sort out what turns out to be human ehrlichiosis, is what they call it, but it's really white-tailed deer disease that gets transferred into people by the bite of ticks. And so in the course of working with those people, I guess they came to think that maybe that organism that I had found, really one of my veterinary students had found, and I was able to demonstrate that it was a different kind of agent. They finally gave it a name. There's a lot of controversy over the years about it. But,
so you didn't get your name attached to that one.
so it was very interesting work with the CDC, because I had already started some work with physicians at the State Health Department in Oklahoma City. And we had established that human beings in Oklahoma, who physicians in Oklahoma always said had Oklahoma tick fever, looked a lot like Rocky Mountain spotted fever, but they didn't have the spots. Mm-hmm. And so I was involved already in working with physicians in the State Health Department, where we found that indeed human beings do have ehrlichiosis in Oklahoma. And then when I was at the CDC, we found that here's another organism, and it's called Ehrlichia chaffiensis, and it's called Ehrlichia chaffiensis because the guy from whom the organism was isolated was a soldier at Fort Chaffee, Arkansas, and that's how it got its name. So
in addition to working with tick-borne diseases, did you spend some time on anaplasmosis?
Yes. When I came back here the third 3 times in 1979. Dr. Bill Brock had recently died, and Dr. Kathy Kosan was a graduate student, and she really needed a major professor. And so I became her major professor, and she was already working on anaplasmosis. She had been with Dr. Brock and with Dr. Ewing Jones. And Dr. Jones had left Oklahoma State to go to Mississippi State, and Dr. Brock had died, and so Dr. Kosan was kind of in the lurch. And well, it was a piece of really good luck for me, because even though I had worked with tick-borne diseases for a long time, I had not actually done any artificial or experimental transfer of disease by way of the tick. I had always done it with a hypodermic needle. And Dr. Kosan was already doing tick transmission studies. Another very important thing that had happened during the time I was away from here, I spent from 1972 to 79 at the University of Minnesota. And during that interval, and I don't know exactly when, Oklahoma State Agricultural Experiment Station set up through the entomology department a tick rearing facility. And so Dr. Kosan was using ticks that were being raised by the tick rearing facility at the Ag Experiment Station. So I joined in the anaplasmosis studies, and I did work with anaplasmosis for a number of years with Dr. Kosan, and she still is pursuing that area of study and is internationally known for her work.
Well, I appreciate it. You talk about your 3 different times. Can you kind of share? Because I know one time you went to a deanship position, but so you come in initially in 58?
No, I graduated from veterinary school in 58, then went to Wisconsin, and I came here in 1960.
Okay.
And then in
you were teaching parasitology?
I was helping Dr. Kroll teach the veterinary students, and I was also teaching a service course in the College of Agriculture. It was called Animal Hygiene, often called Veterinary Parasitology, although it was much more general than veterinary parasitology. I taught that, and then I also taught the first graduate course in protozoology. But after getting my PhD, I moved to Kansas State in early 1965.
65, okay.
And I was there for a few years, and then it was either 64 or 65. I'd have to look at the CV. You'd think you wouldn't forget that, but anyway.
65.
Yeah, early in the year.
65.
Yeah, and then I was there for a few years, and then I went to Mississippi State, and then when Dr. Besh left to become the founding dean at OSU, I came back here in his job, which was Dr. Kroll's job. Dr. Kroll had been forced to retire, actually, system-wide. In my view, a terrible mistake on the part of the Board of Regents, but they, in those days, could force retirements, and so anybody who was 65 had to retire. And although Dr. Kroll had been promised by President Wilhelm and by Dean Glenn Holm that he could teach till he was 70, he was suddenly forced to retire just because of the system-wide rule. And Dr. Besh became the head of the department then. And so then when Dr. Besh left in April of 68, they got in touch with me in Mississippi, and I came back November the 1st, 1968 as the department head. And then I was here then until the end of 72, and I went to the University of Minnesota, where I served as dean of the College of Veterinary Medicine.
That's quite a signal honor to be dean.
Well, I enjoyed it very much. I have enjoyed every job I've ever had. I felt very fortunate in that regard. And then I moved back here in January of 1979 into my old job as head of the department.
But is there a story there, Dr. Ewing? I mean, you think you're dean, and pretty prestigious job, so you were there, what, about 7 years, something like that, 6, 7 years?
Yep.
What brought you back to Oklahoma State?
Well, one thing that brought us back was 2 jobs. My wife had gotten her PhD at Oklahoma State. She actually finished up the research work while we were at Kansas State, but she had gotten both her master's and her PhD in the zoology department here. And while we were here in the period of 68 to 72, she was teaching invertebrate zoology. But when we moved to the University of Minnesota, it was just a bad time for zoologists, and she could not get a job teaching in her field. And so she did sort of a self-supported postdoc, learned a lot about water and water quality and mycology. But what she really did in terms of professional work outside of just taking some more courses was she became an editor for the University of Minnesota Press. And Dean Brock had retired, and Dr. Patrick Morgan had become dean of the veterinary school, and we were friends and actually classmates at the University of Georgia. And he approached me about coming back in my old job, and I said, well, I need 2 jobs. And so they found a temporary job for my wife, Dr. Margaret Ewing, and then that eventually grew into a tenure-track job, and she found herself as a middle-aged lady trying to earn tenure, which she did, but it was really a chance for both of us to work in our field that was important in bringing us back.
Did you feel any sense of loss or demotion or prestige?
Well, I really did not, because money was never really that important to me. I was making more money there, of course. I took a pay cut to come back here, but it was cheaper living here too. But I really knew that I would have a limited life as an administrator. My wife definitely did not want me to go any higher in administration. I was approached, for example, about a job as an academic vice president. And she was just very plain that she really didn't want that kind of a family life. And so that had an impact, of course. But we both loved Oklahoma, and it was good to come back. And I liked my old job here, and I knew I would have more time to get back to some bench research, which I really had not done any bench research at the University of Wisconsin. I had stayed in touch with my field of veterinary parasitology, but to a much more limited degree than I would like to have. Plus the fact that I had done a lot of things that I wanted to do at the University of Minnesota. We had built a new building. We had almost had things in hand for a second new building. And I had already told Dean Morgan that I would come back to OSU, irrespective of what happened in the legislature in Minnesota that spring. And it was very interesting. The veterinary school funding got tied up with, it was kind of a veterinary school or the law school was going to get a new building. Well, we'd had a new building fairly recently, but we still needed another new building. But the law school won out. And so it was after I left that they finally did get it approved. But it was a very interesting experience because one of the members of the legislature was a veterinarian. He was actually a black veterinarian who was a graduate of Kansas State University. And he was a great supporter of us in the legislature. But he was also tied up in a situation where they needed a new prison at St. Peter, Minnesota. And he was on a committee that was trying to get that funded. And so between the new prison at St. Peter, Minnesota, and the new law school on the Minneapolis campus, we ended up on the short end. But I'd already decided to leave anyway. Many people thought I left because of that, but it was not. I'd already decided to leave. But it was a lot of fun. I enjoyed my time there, and it was a great place, a great university. But I was also reluctant to grow old in that climate. I really liked the winter climate in Oklahoma.
Doctor, you've had the gamut. You taught in classroom instruction, research, product extension work, sort of administration, department head, dean. What did you enjoy the most out of that? And what appealed to you the most?
Well, it really is a hard question to answer. As I said earlier, I have liked every job I've ever had. But if I had to just select one, it would be teaching. I really love teaching. But I'm still doing research. I'm in my 75th year and retired, but and of course I still do teaching. I don't do much formal classroom teaching. I give guest lectures mostly, but I do offer an elective in veterinary history. I'm not offering it this spring because I'm going to be gone for a trip to India, but I really enjoy interacting with veterinary students.
Do you have a recollection of some students you particularly enjoyed and have gone on, maybe enjoyed success?
Yes, there are an awful lot of those. I'll mention one first from a course I taught, as I mentioned earlier, here on the main campus rather than in the veterinary school. I had a man named Herschel Giles who later came to veterinary school, and he said that he wouldn't have gone to veterinary school if he hadn't taken my undergraduate course. And then he later got a PhD with Roger Pansiera, who I know you have interviewed, and Dr. Giles became a well-known veterinary pathologist in his own right. There was another man in that same course, not the same semester that had Dr. Giles, but his name was William Hornboken. He was a student from Illinois who had come here to major in animal science because his family farm back in Illinois, there was some connection with faculty in animal science here. Well, I had him in that undergraduate course, and he later was in the military and then got out, and he was farming, and he ran into some health problems and decided to go back to graduate school and became a PhD animal scientist. And he taught at Oregon State and at the Virginia Polytechnic Institute, VPI. And I'm still in touch with him all these years later. When it comes to veterinary students, of course, there are an awful lot of them that I could name. One of the latest was a young man who worked in my lab as a pre-veterinary student. And then I would never hire a student to work for me during his or her freshman year in veterinary school. I felt they had to get their academic feet under them because it's a different league than the pre-professional work. But his name is Dennis Crow. He's from out near Blackwell. And Dennis Crow worked for me as a pre-vet student, and then from the second through the fourth years, he worked for me. And now he's a dermatologist, a veterinary dermatologist, in a exclusive practice in Dallas, Texas, and just making a wonderful name for himself as a dermatologist. And I would like it very much if he were an academician, but you know, over the years, I've had some very good graduate students too. Of course, Dr. Kathy Kosan was an outstanding graduate student, and she, as I said, she's a Regents Professor today, as well as an endowed professor and internationally known. My last graduate student was a man named John Sheehan's Matthew. He's actually from India. Today works for Merck & Company in Rahway, New Jersey. But both Dr. Matthew and Dr. Crow named sons for me, which is better than having a parasite named for you.
That's great. Well, you had an opportunity to work under several different deans, through those years. From a faculty perspective, can you share some of your insights on maybe the leadership and contributions of each?
Yes, I'd be glad to do that. Dr. Glenn Holm was the dean when I came here, and he had been dean of agriculture, I believe, at North Dakota State. And he had very good rapport with the Agricultural Experiment Station. He'd been director of the Agricultural Experiment Station at North Dakota. It's sort of like it is at OSU, dean and director, and you cover the College of Agriculture as well as the experiment station. So I think that helped Dean Holm very much in our interactions with the experiment station. He also had a philosophy that he wanted strong academic heads, and I think that he had strong academic heads, definitely with Krull, I believe with Dr. Dwayne Peterson and Dr. Leslie McDonald. All of these people were strong academicians, and he supported them to run their departments, and I think he was a very successful dean. He also had good contacts with other deans around the country, and I think he joined forces with some of them to help get some favorable legislation passed at the federal level. Dr. Brock became dean under very trying circumstances. We had a dean whose name was Carl Reinhard. And Carl Reinhard was a very, very well-trained veterinarian, and he was a public health specialist and had a lot of experience in public health service. He did not have a lot of experience and no experience in being dean of the veterinary school. And he got crosswise with I think the old department heads and with the central administration, and in my judgment was not really given a fair opportunity. He was forced out as dean within a year of his appointment. So it's hard to know what might have happened under his guidance had things not gone awry. I personally had a wonderful relationship with him and was very saddened when we had the uproar over that. But then Dr. Brock became dean, and I think he was a very good appointment as an interim. I think when he was made permanent dean, it was very hard on him and probably hard on the school, in my opinion. Of course, I left and went to the University of Minnesota during this time, and he and I remained good friends, and he visited me at the University of Minnesota, And we talked about one of the very sad things that had happened, and that was that the legislature had inserted itself into the admissions process at the veterinary school. And that was a tough time. And I don't think Dr. Brock was really up to the job, the political aspects of the job. He was a very nice man. He was, I believe, a good veterinary scientist. Well, Dr. Boga, President Boga, actually said to me soon after I came back here, I think we finally killed Bill Brock by keeping him in that job too long. And then Dr. Brock was followed by Dr. Pat Morgan, who I mentioned earlier, was a classmate of mine at the University of Georgia, and we had been good friends. And I thought Pat Morgan was absolutely the perfect person to follow Dr. Brock, because Pat Morgan had political skills, and he had been in the state health department in Oklahoma City, and I think from a political standpoint, Pat was excellent. But we fell on hard times with him too, for reasons that maybe don't need to be reviewed. But suffice it to say that the academic department heads had some differences of opinion with him, and they came down to the academic health of the college, and so the central administration made the decision to remove all the heads, and then within a short time after that, Dr. Morgan resigned, and the regents gave him a year, and he went to the Caribbean to work for Ross University, and then he came back as a faculty member after that. And now we have, after that we had Joe Alexander, and Joe Alexander was, I think, a highly successful dean in that he had good political instincts, and he also was a bit like Glenn Holm in that he wanted strong academic heads, and I think he more or less gave the academic heads the freedom, and he supported them as best he could. And then President Halligan tapped him to move to the central administration on an interim basis, but it turned out to be permanent, I guess. And Dr. Alexander had brought back one of our own graduates, Mike Lorenz. Dr. Lorenz graduated. He was a senior when I came back here in the fall of 1968, so I didn't actually teach him, but I'd gotten to know him over the years very well. And he had come back as Associate Dean for Academic Affairs. I had actually served in that role on an interim basis for Joe Alexander when Mac Waller retired. But then Dr. Lorenz became the interim dean. And he asked me, I was ready to retire, but he asked me, what about being interim dean, interim associate dean again? And so I said, well, if the faculty wants that, I'll delay retirement. And so I did, and did that again. Well, then, of course, Dr. Lorenz was eventually appointed the permanent dean, and I think he has done a fantastic job. He is one of those persons who is an excellent teacher. He's a skilled clinician, and in spite of being the dean, he has managed to keep his hand in the clinic with neurologic cases, and the clinicians respect him for that. The practitioners in the state respect him for that, and I think that he is having been born and raised in Oklahoma, he's probably more at ease with the political environment here than, for example, I would be as a dean. I just have to honestly say, I probably, I was okay as a department head and okay as an associate dean for academic affairs, but I probably wouldn't be very suitable for the dean of the veterinary school at Oklahoma State, just because I'm not as at ease with the political aspects of the job as I was in Minnesota, for example. So that's sort of my thumbnail sketch of the deans I've experienced here.
Appreciate it. Okay. We're going to stop right here for a minute. I'm going to change tapes on you, and then if you don't mind, we'll keep about another 10 minutes or so. I've got about 2 more questions, okay?
Sure.
Okay, we're back. You were talking about some of the deans. We just finished up a conversation there, Dr.
Yes.
Ewing. Granted, you left a couple times, but you came back. You've been here several years. What kept you at OSU so long? I mean, what kept you going?
Well, when I came here in 1960, I thought the esprit de corps among the faculty was just excellent. And I worked with Roger Pansier over the years. I worked with a man named Ralph Buckner, who's now deceased, who was in the small animal clinic. And we just had a wonderful working relationship, and I thoroughly enjoyed that. And the people of Oklahoma, I just really like the friendly atmosphere of Oklahoma. I like Stillwater. And as I said earlier, I like the winter climate here much better than Minnesota. And I still miss the green pine trees of Georgia, but and I never have gotten to like the wind in Oklahoma. But that period from 1960 to early 65 was wonderful. The period 63 to 72, again, my wife and I both had jobs here. We both loved our jobs. We had a house that we could walk to campus. Both of us could walk to campus. We had small children and could afford to have someone come into the home to take care of them when we were away. And then we went to the University of Minnesota, and we loved it there. But when the opportunity came for 2 jobs and to come back to Oklahoma, I just thought it was the thing to do. And I have no regrets. I have enjoyed very much. I do regret, of course, that we had some difficulties over the years. There were really 3 that all related to the Board of Regents. The first was when they forced Dr. Krull to retire. I remember writing Dr. Wilhelm a letter about that. And that was a sad day. And then the thing over Dean Reinhard, that was another difficult time for us. President Kalm and I had our differences there, but we remained friends after that. And then, of course, when Dr. Boggs and Dr. Boger, and I guess the Board of Regents, I actually decided to remove all the academic heads, and then shortly after that, Dr. Morgan decided to leave the deanship. Those were all sad times, but the school, I hope, didn't suffer too much for it. We certainly made our efforts, that is Roger Pansier and Dan Goodwin and Fane Oberst and Everett Short and I all made our efforts to shield the faculty from any adverse effects of the debacle in 1984. But what's kept me here is that I just like the place, and I've invested a lot in it, and I like to think I've made contributions that have been useful, and I feel as if I have. just earlier this month, the Conference of Research Workers in Animal Diseases in Chicago, Illinois, was dedicated to me. And that was the first place I gave a professional paper, 50 years earlier to the month. And
so what was it again now that's dedicated to you?
It's called the Conference of Research Workers in Animal Diseases. It was the 89th meeting of that group. They started in 1920, and they dedicate the meeting to somebody each year. And this year it was me, so
that's pretty special.
Yeah, it was.
Wow.
Wow. You know, and I've been recognized probably more than I deserve. Here in Oklahoma, I'm inducted into the Higher Education Hall of Fame some years ago, and you know, it's just been a good place to work, and my wife and I both like it a lot.
That's great.
Cool. Now, all of our kids live on the East Coast, so I suppose eventually, if we get old enough, we'll have to move. But right now, we're retired in Oklahoma, and thank goodness I'm still welcome at the veterinary school. And they depend on me some there for institutional memory. I've written three little books about either veterinary history or veterinary history associated with Oklahoma State University.
Too bad the time whether you could have written the Centennial History book if you'd been retired that far.
Well, you know, I did contribute to the Centennial History book. The chapter in there, Dr. Williams, of course, was the chief author, but the chapter on graduate education I wrote, and that was in part because Wendell Krull, who was my major professor, had such a central role in getting graduate education started.
Well, you know, speaking of what's kept you here, what are some special memories for you? Some highlights of your career here at OSU?
Well, I would say that the interactions with students, and you know, there's so many of them that flood my mind. The joy of working on diseases that the teaching hospital. I always tell young faculty, the teaching hospital is a laboratory of naturally occurring disease, and you need to take advantage of that. It's important for us as faculty to address issues that are of importance to the state of Oklahoma, and to have been involved in the discovery of Ehrlichia canis for the first time in North America, to been involved in the discovery of what is now called Ehrlichia ewingii, to have been involved in the discovery of human ehrlichiosis in Oklahoma, and to have more recently, continuing with Dr. Pansiera, who's been retired even longer than I have, to work on canine hepatozoonosis, first discovered in Oklahoma in 1996, 20 years after it was first found on the Gulf Coast. It's just been a great deal of fun to do the detective work, and you know, we probably published, I don't know how many papers, but in connection with my being honored in Chicago earlier this month, I gave a talk in which, when I was putting it together, my wife asked me, Dr. Margaret Ewing asked me, how many people have you published with? And I said, I don't know. So she sat down with my CV and counted, and it was, I think, 180 some odd.
Wow.
People, and maybe 160 odd people. I'm not sure exactly, but anyway, and 80, I do remember this figure, 81 of them are people, and they're at 20 different institutions, maybe more, a few more than 20 different institutions, where I've done cooperative work me in Stillwater and then wherever.
Mm-hmm.
And we've published probably in the neighborhood of 200 or more papers. And, to have those affiliations here and at other institutions, it's just been a continuing series of highlights.
Great. Well, hey, did you do any what I'd call outreach or extension work with Dr. Tom Thedford?
Well, I never had an extension appointment, but I did do a lot of what I call extension work because I would go out and talk to veterinarians about what I was doing and what was new in the field of veterinary parasitology. I would also field an awful lot of calls. Nothing like Dr. Roger Pansierra. He has done more. He's never had an extension job either, but he's done more extension work than probably anybody because veterinarians just call him all the time, still do to this day, with questions about cases. So yeah, I did outreach work, although not in a formal.
Well, Dr. Ewing, how important is it from your perspective that the college stays connected with practitioners, where you go out and interact with, give presentations, meet with, bring them back on campus? Is that important to the college?
I think it's exceedingly important to the college, and I think that's one of the things that Dr. Lorenz has been more successful with than any previous dean. We need the alums to know that we are here for them. We need them to feel that they have a responsibility to us. And I think that the more we can interact with them to help them with their problems, to have them feel free to come to us with their diagnostic problems and with their concerns about things that the school can address that they cannot as individual veterinarians. I think it helps the profession in the state, and it helps the school enormously, as well as helping the individual practitioners.
It's easy to get disconnected, isn't it? I mean, unintentionally, just getting wrapped up in research and teaching.
It is very easy to become disconnected, and we have some people on our faculty today who are full-time researchers. Some of them are not veterinarians. And some of those people are exceedingly important because they bring in outside money that brings in overhead. But in terms of really being an integral part of the college, there's a dimension that's missing. They can't really interact with our graduates. And they do some things that some faculty can't do, like succeed in bringing in money that has overhead attached to it. But when I was a department head and when I was a dean and associate dean for academic affairs, I had the philosophy until very late in my career that a land-grant institution has three responsibilities: teaching, research, and outreach. And I thought a faculty member in a veterinary college ought to be able to produce on two of those three fronts, and that it was a mistake to sequester faculty into any one of those three. Full-time teachers can get stale. Full-time researchers can become too centrally focused, and full-time outreach people can be so overstretched that they don't have time to stay up to date. And late in my career, of course, I had to accept that we probably had come to a point when we might have to have full-time researchers, just because in order to compete in the arena of raising money that has overhead attached to it, it's very, very hard to compete there if you have very many other responsibilities. I would still contend that those people would be better researchers if they at least taught graduate students who were veterinarians, people who've already got their DVM degree who are working on master's or PhD degrees or working on specialty board certification. I think those faculty ought to do some of that because it would be good for them as well as for the school. But I'm glad I'm not dean now.
When I was interviewing Dean Alexander, Joe Alexander, he really, a lot of his mission was outreach and connections, and he talked about the importance of, he didn't do it for that reason, but an important unintended consequence possibly was fundraising, where you develop relationships, and sometimes wasn't with the practitioner, but practitioners, customers or clients.
Yes, Dr. Alexander was very successful in that way. I think that the Sitlington money that has been very important really came because the veterinarian, Mr. Sitlington's veterinarian, told Joe Alexander about, here's this, I think he was a dairy farmer who's got all this land that they're going to make Quail Springs Mall out of or something.
Right.
And not only veterinary medicine, but agriculture also got a lot of money from Mr. Sitlington. And those kinds of things, I think, are very important. And I think Mike Lorenz has followed Joe Alexander's lead with those sort of things. And then, of course, as I said, I think Mike has been very, very successful in staying active himself as a consulting neurologist, and that has made a lot of friends for the college with the practitioners.
You talked a lot about different aspects of the college. How's, in your opinion, how has it changed over the years?
Well, of course, it's gotten to be a lot bigger. The esprit de corps that I saw there in the early 1960s, I'm sure probably exists in isolated spots, but for the whole faculty, it's just not there because it's just too big these days. And the other thing that I just discussed, where we have now some faculty who are sequestered into roles strictly as researchers, a few who are strictly teachers, and maybe one or two who are pretty much full-time extension. In my view, the college would be better served if we could cling to the old philosophy, and I admit an old philosophy of mine, that you ought to be able to produce on two of the three fronts. We've had some triple threats. Raj Pansera was definitely a triple threat. We have Tony Confer today, who really does all three. I say of myself that I probably did all three things, and threw in a bit of administration along the way. But it's probably, I probably just have to admit that there are certain roles in research that maybe I have to accept that if we're lucky enough to get a non-veterinarian who's interested in working on animal diseases, we may have to accept that they're going to do research only. I don't like it, though.
Was another change been more women in veterinary medicine?
Well, of course, in terms of the student body and the faculty as well, that is a terrific change. And I hope that some real historian is going to take this on as a project someday, not just for Oklahoma State, but for the profession in general. When I came here, we had just one or two women in a class. The women from Texas, because Texas A&M didn't accept women in those days. My class at the University of Georgia, there were 64 of us, and there were 2 women. But of course, today the women outnumber the men nationally, and in our school, we were probably the last school to ever have a class that had more women than men, and that has not always been the case. I don't even know what the figures are today, but we certainly have a lot more than we used to I was the department head who hired the first full professor, who was a woman, Dr. Helen Jordan. Dr. Jordan had taught me parasitology at the University of Georgia. And when I came back here in 1968 and 1969, I hired her because I was it in parasitology. Dr. Besh had gone to LSU, and I was department head and teaching. My goodness, when I came in the fall of 1968, November the 1st, they had not even taught parasitology in the beginning of the semester. I had to teach 6 days a week, 6 lectures a week, 2 laboratories, and those laboratories were split, so 4 laboratories a week by myself while being department head. Oh. So I was so glad that I was able to lure Dr. Jordan away from the University of Georgia. And I'll be forever grateful to Dr. Reinhardt, who was the dean at that time. She was associate professor, already tenured at Georgia, and she'd been associate professor for a while. And he said, I believe she's qualified to come in as full professor. And he agreed with it. I thought that. So she was the first woman full professor in veterinary medicine in Oklahoma. So,
well, speaking of changes, if you just look at the profession broadly, not just Oklahoma State, but the veterinary medical profession, how has it changed and how has it continued to change?
Well, one of the changes is that we have so many specialties now. The first specialty board was veterinary pathology. And over the years, I'm not sure just how many boards we have now, but all of these operate through the American Veterinary Medical Association. We have never had, interestingly enough, a board for veterinary parasitology. The reason for that is that a lot of people who call themselves veterinary parasitologists are actually animal parasitologists who are not veterinarians. But they work on veterinary problems. And that's a good thing because we never did have enough DVM PhDs to really do the job that needed to be done. Dr. Kroll had his PhD a long time before he got his DVM. And we have a couple of those around the country. But anyway, that's been a major change. And one of the important things about that for our particular veterinary school is that we are one of the smallest schools, and we just don't have the budget. We don't have the Oklahoma money behind us to have as many specialties as we should have if we're going to compete successfully at the national level. I think Dr. Lorenz has an approach to this that's being very successful, but if we could find a way to get more state money to fund some more specialties in the teaching hospital, it would be good. It impacts us in multiple ways. One of the ways is that I mentioned Dr. Dennis Crow earlier. I'd love it if he were an academician. But when he was doing his residency in dermatology at the University of Florida, he said to me, Dr. Ewing, I don't see very many faculty who are happy in their jobs. And he said, I know I'll have a lot more time for my family if I go into a private specialty practice. Mm-hmm. Well, we see that a lot. We cannot keep good faculty in our clinic because they have the opportunity to go elsewhere to earn more money. And they don't have, if they don't have the dedication to teaching and the dedication to trying to pursue in depth the study of naturally occurring disease, they're going to go someplace else. And I think that hurts and that's not just the local problem. I think it's more difficult at Oklahoma State than it is at a place like the University of Minnesota because our funding base is smaller and our Our faculty is just smaller. We're a small program.
Speaking of small, is the change from large animal to small animal practice, has that significantly impacted the profession?
Well, that's been a problem for us for a long time, and our college has come under some criticism at times from people who said, "Well, you're just taking smart students. You ought to be taking some of these farm boys who would come back and practice on large animal medicine." But we know that really has never worked here or anywhere else. You look at me personally. I grew up on a dairy farm, but I didn't become a dairy practitioner. Uh, and 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 it's really, I mean, you just cannot take students who are not academically strong. Uh, when I mentioned earlier about Dean Brock facing that problem from the legislature, there was a politically well-connected student who did not get admitted because he wasn't qualified. And when he was forced on the faculty, I wasn't here as a part of it, of course he struggled. And we've seen that when we take people, when we get down to taking people who are marginally qualified, we get in trouble. Now, I don't think we have ever taken anybody who couldn't do it, but what we have done is take people who think they can do it, and they have other things they're trying to do, probably for good reason. They have to have a job, they have a family they have to feed, but they need to understand, they must understand that if they're not really academically very strong, they're going to struggle and they may flunk out. And it is a terrible thing when we lose a student for academic reasons.
But what is that rate usually from starting in the freshman year to graduation? What percentage typically will graduate?
Well, we aim to have 100% graduate. We'd like 100% to graduate in 4 years. That, it is much better now than it was during that period there in the 1970s when we were forced to, or the school, I wasn't here, when the school was forced to take marginally qualified people. You'd have to ask Dr. Lorenz what the latest figures are, but the last stint I did 2 stints as the interim Associate Dean for Academic Affairs. It seems to me that we were up to losing 2, sometimes 3 out of a class of about 70 odd. And we had a way of giving them a year off, and if they could qualify or compete to get back in, sometimes we'd let them back in without competing with the incoming class. Just depended on the situation. And there's a faculty committee that made that determination. That was not an administrative, well, ultimately it was an administrative decision, but it was always carefully considered faculty opinion in the form of an academic standards committee. And so we had some, we readmitted, I can think of about 2 or 3 that we readmitted who washed out again and never made it. And that is tragic for them individually, and it's such a waste of resources for the institution and the taxpayer, obviously.
Sure. What have been significant milestones for the college over the years, significant achievements?
Well, I would say that, one of the embarrassing things for Carl Reinhardt when he came in here as dean, he was not told that the school was on academic probation with the American Veterinary Medical Association. And I remember the day we got the letter and we were looking at it, and he said, "Oh, I think when it says that we are continued on probation. I think that just means that the school is continued and will be on probation. And it turned out that the school had never been fully accredited, and it never did become fully accredited until the Morgan administration. And so that was a milestone. I mean, the school put out perfectly qualified people. You look back on some of the giants of the profession who got their DVM at Oklahoma A&M and at Oklahoma State University. There's no question that we were qualified to be granting the degree, but it was an embarrassment for Carl Reinhardt, obviously, and the faculty. That should have been shared with the faculty. I don't know why it wasn't.
And it was the lack of a teaching hospital part of the problem
yes,
too?
that was a part of the problem.
That
was one of the things where, when old Senator Murphy was very instrumental in getting that appropriation for the teaching hospital. Again, I was at Minnesota at the time, but I know that he was very instrumental in that. And I don't know just what the trade-offs were to get it named the board of Veterinary Medical Teaching Hospital, but it's all right. It has the OU president's name on it.
Still rank with some alumni.
No doubt. But yes, once that teaching hospital came online, then that made it possible. It was never really the faculty, although the faculty numbers were slim enough that there were problems. And one of the little books that I wrote, if you read our official history book, it says that we had a veterinary school here in the 19-teens, early 1920s. And the official history that Dr. Williams wrote says that we don't know why there were no graduates. Well, what I discovered in the National Archives, actually when I was there looking for material about Dr. Krull, what I discovered was correspondence with L.L. Lewis with the Bureau of Animal Industry, that Oklahoma A&M was never granted the authorization to grant the DVM degree. And that's why we had no graduates. We were granted or they were granted back there in I believe it was 1919. They granted us, the school, the opportunity to do the first 2 years, and then the graduates could go away to a place that could grant the DVM degree. And that's a very important piece of history that had been lost. As far as I can determine, there was no record of it here. But I'm glad I stumbled onto it in the National Archives. And what happened was that C.H. McElroy, who is our founding dean, was on the faculty of that old A&M department. He was teaching microbiology, and Dr. Lewis hoped that the Bureau of Animal Industry would count him as if he were already a veterinarian, but they were not having it. They had to have a minimum of 5 graduates who graduated from veterinary colleges that were approved by the government, and they were not. So then McElroy went to St. Joseph Veterinary College in St. Joseph, Missouri. And the official history book that Dr. Williams wrote says he was over there 4 years and came back with his DVM degree. What I discovered in the National Archives was that he went over there in the fall of 1918, and he came back after one academic year in 1919 with his DVM, because he had done his 2 years at Oklahoma A&M, and they were at the point of shifting to from 3 years to 4 years, but he was grandfathered in and did it in 3 years. The other interesting thing to me is that there had been a local practitioner in Stillwater who had been assisting Dr. Lewis with the work in the college then, the college herds. He had his own private practice. He was a licensed veterinarian, but he was a licensed non-graduate veterinarian. And I tell this story in the book I wrote about the history of the Oklahoma Veterinary Medical Association. The graduate veterinarians started before statehood trying to get the legislature in Guthrie to pass a law that you had to be a graduate of an approved veterinary college in order to practice. Well, they never got the job done. We became a state in 1907, and they still hadn't gotten the job done. And I believe it was maybe 1913 when they finally got the legislation passed that you had to have a license to practice veterinary medicine in Oklahoma. However, on the day that they first issued licenses, they issued two kinds of licenses. One was to graduate veterinarians, and the other to non-graduate veterinarians. You look at their licenses. The only difference is they both had a number on them, and the non-graduates had an N following the number. Well, there was at least one of those persons still practicing in Oklahoma when I came here in 1960. But to go back to the earlier story, McElroy really was the second member of the Stillwater community to go over to St. Joseph, Missouri. This local private practitioner was admitted over there before McElroy was. And he would have come back in the spring of 1919 with his degree, I'm confident, but instead he came back in a pine box. He got the flu, the great flu pandemic, and he died in St. Joe. He's buried out here east of town in the cemetery east of town. So that all is, I think, a very interesting story that has been lost here on campus. And I'm really glad that I had just stumbled on the correspondence in the National Archives.
Interesting. What, in your opinion, have been the strengths of the college over the years?
Well, I think we are well recognized in a lot of places outside of Oklahoma as producing graduates who are ready to practice. Now, a lot of our graduates go and do internships and residence. Some of them do residencies. A lot of them go to work for private practitioners, and they are not as ready to practice as they will be in a year or two, but they are much better qualified than graduates of many institutions where they do not get as much hands-on opportunity as they get here. This was especially in the 1960s. I remember we had a small animal clinician named Bruce Blau. Dr. Blau got his veterinary degree of VMD at the University of Pennsylvania. It's the only school that gives a VMD. But he said, my goodness, these students go out of here, this is the 60s now, these students go out of here so much more ready to practice than we were coming out of the University of Pennsylvania. And it was because we had such a small faculty, they had to do it, and they learned to do it while they were still students. And so I think that's one of the things that we've been known for. Dr. Lorenz was telling me recently that the Associate Dean for Research, Dr. Malayer, has done an analysis that shows that even though we're a small program, we leverage the money that the state puts into veterinary medicine through OSU to a greater extent than almost any other school. So the state dollars are really an investment, a good investment for the state. And so I think I hesitate to say this, but I've said it privately, and I may as well go on record as saying it, that our school and I might even include the whole university here, not just the veterinary college, we probably are better than we deserve to be, given the funding level we've had. We've made do, and I know the veterinary college more intimately, obviously, but it's kind of a double-edged sword. You make do with what you get, and then it's expected that you can do it, therefore you will do it. And that has happened. But I'm not sure it can continue to happen if you don't have people like Roger Pansiera, for example. He could have gone any place he wanted to go, but he chose to stay here. And I'm not sure we can depend on that in the future. And at some point, it's likely that that they're going to have to put more state money into the program. I thought at one point that just before I left to go to the University of Minnesota, there in the early 70s, I thought that we might actually have to fold as a school. And I knew from my discussion with Dr. Kroll and with Dr. Pansiera, who was, of course, a student, that there in the late 40s and early 50s, there were times when they weren't sure they were going to be able to make it. But they have made it, and I think have made it not just hanging on by fingernails, but have really made it. A lot of it's come out of the hide of a dedicated faculty, but I think it's a good, solid school, and I just hope it can remain so.
Speaking of remaining so, Dr. Ewing, what advice would you give to current and future faculty administrators to advance the mission of the college?
Well, I would say continue this work of Alexander and Lorenz in staying well connected with the profession. Stay well connected to agriculture as best we can. I mean, the political clout of the agriculture community in this state is still important. And the veterinary school needs to be doing its part to stay in the good graces with agriculture, so that OSU as a whole flourishes and that the veterinary college specifically flourishes. The veterinary college can help, as we talked about earlier, in staying connected with the profession. The veterinarians themselves probably don't have too much political clout. They're too small a group, but they have connections with their clientele that are very important. So I think those things are important to do. It's also very important that the academic leadership of the college stay well connected to the academic community nationally. The veterinary profession is fairly small, but we need to know where good graduate education is going on so we know where to recruit faculty. We need to build our graduate program so that people look to us. I'm glad you raised this question, because Dr. Kathy Kosan, who, as I've said, I took on as a graduate student, and today is herself very well recognized. She's not a veterinarian. She's a PhD, but she works on anaplasmosis, which is an important disease. She doesn't work on the clinical aspects of it, but she's working on vaccines, which are important clinically. But she gave a paper in New Orleans right after the meeting in Chicago. She gave a paper at the meeting in Chicago where I was recognized. And then she went to New Orleans and she gave a paper on the current work that's going on here with ticks and anaplasmosis and the interrelationship. And I was told that after her paper, a person said, "Do you have any postdocs that are ready to move on? We will take any postdoc you'll send us."
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we need. We need programs that people recognize as being important to produce new veterinary scientists. And we're doing it in a few places, and we need to do it in more places. And we need to be able to compete, not only to attract faculty, but to keep faculty. As I said earlier, it's people get opportunities to go elsewhere, and a lot of it is to go into these private specialty practices where they can make more money and they don't have committee work and those things. And you need to work at identifying people who care about teaching. You need to be able to find out what it is that makes them tick, and then see that you try to keep them and keep them happy.
I'm going to close with a couple paired questions here.
All right.
What do you feel has been your legacy? I mean, I know it's a tough question to answer, but all humility aside.
Well, I think I have had an important impact. They tell me this, people have had an important impact on the lives of a number of veterinarians and a number of graduate students. And I appreciate that very much, and appreciate that assessment, and I hope it's true. I think people kid me a lot about the care with which I write and the care with which I insist graduate students write. And Dr. Kosan presented me as the dedicatee in Chicago, and she told a story that probably true, that I made her write a thesis 6 times. So that's probably...
That was the Kroll effect.
Yeah, that was the Kroll effect. He made me write mine probably 6 times. So yeah, I think I've had some individual impact on individual persons. And on the institution generally, I hope I've brought some insistence on academic quality. And my interest in history, I hope I have engendered some appreciation for the institution's history. I was so pleased when Dr. Lorenz decided to mark this as the 60th year of the beginning of classes for the veterinary school. He has an appreciation for history, and I hope I live long enough to see the 75-year celebration. We'll see. But so those things, I think I've had an impact, and I've been lucky enough to have research that has gotten some national and international attention, and so that has helped the school, I think. The last graduate student I had, I mentioned him earlier, a man from India. He came to me because his parasitology teacher in India sent him to me. And that man had gotten his master's degree with Dr. Kroll at the same time I was working on my PhD. And, we had stayed in touch over the years. And so, that has, I have had other students who came to me because of the reputation. And, that has an impact on I think the academic milieu is enriched by having people from other cultures and other institutions. And so I hope I've had a positive role there.
Well, how do you hope people remember Sidney Ewing, DVM?
Well, maybe as a as a person who spent most of his professional career at one institution, but also worked at a couple of three others, and I hope I had a positive impact on all of them. I just am very grateful that I had the chance to work at Oklahoma State 3 times and have the chance as a retiree to still work there.
Keep asking you back. Well, Doctor, anything else you can think of that we haven't covered? I know that's your long history, and of course you've written some of that history, but you've lived a lot of it also. But is there anything we haven't covered that's important that someone listening to this interview 10, 20 years from now would want to know or pick up?
Well, I don't know. I just hope that some of the things we've talked about this afternoon in terms of the importance of the school staying current with the profession in this state and nationally and internationally, that I think that's an absolute must if the school is going to prosper. And I also think it's probably a must that some way be found to undergird with state money or with money from wealthy donors to better endow the program, because it is a competitive situation today, and we are a small program but a good program. We don't need to get big, but we need to be big enough to stay strong academically, and I just hope that can happen. And I have confidence that it will. I hope that whoever follows Mike Lorenz as dean will avail himself of or herself of a look at the history of the place and understand how it has come to be what it is, and will have the vision to help make it what it deserves to be in the future.